Okay, so I have to give you a little historical background for Beowulf, so bear with me, okay? All right, so we're going to begin with a map of modern Europe just to orient us. And I think just a little background is useful for understanding who composed Beowulf, the epic, and why it's such a valued cultural artifact. So, around 400, as the Roman Empire was collapsing, um, the military troops who had once occupied Britain since about the year zero began to withdraw. Starting about 100 years later, various tribal groups from Sweden and Germany and Denmark began to either migrate or invade, depending on your point of view. King Arthur dates to this time period and was remembered for holding off these invaders from a corner of the island. Which corner remains in dispute. The action in Beowulf takes place in the early 500s when these migrations were in progress. Hrothgar lived outside of Copenhagen, and excavations have revealed a huge meat hall that was in use for a few hundred years from about the 500s to the 800s. And Beowulf was from a region that is now in Sweden. So the poem as we have it was written down in England around the year 1000. The Anglo-Saxon language in the poem, however, is several hundred years older. Okay, so what? Well, this suggests that the poet in 1000 is either is either basing his poem on oral, right, on an oral myth or legend, or that he is transcribing or using a text that's much older. The action in the poem takes place around 500. Okay, why does it matter? Well, one might ask why people in England cared about Scandinavian myth. And the answer is that those original invaders probably brought the story with them. And recent Viking invasions that were beginning around 800 might have generated new interest in the tales of their mythical ancestors. Okay, so the poem begins with Hrothgar's lineage. He's descended from the legendary Shield-Shaven, or Shield-Shafson, as he's called in the translation, who models the attributes of a good king. He receives a hero's funeral, being cast adrift in a boat. And it's interesting that not only in Scandinavia, but also in England, there's evidence of these ship burials. Sutton Hoo is the most famous site. It was discovered in the 1940s, and one of the mounds that has been excavated is clearly that of a tribal leader living in the 600s. He was buried with weapons and armor and the kinds of accoutrement that you might need for the afterlife, including kitchen utensils. In Beowulf Part 2, I include an image of two spoons, silver spoons that say Saul and Paul, suggesting that this leader had at least some familiarity with Christianity or was a Christian himself. And here's a picture of what the king would have looked like with all of his gear. And his belt buckle alone basically was worth a high warrior's life. Okay, the genre of the poem is usually described as a heroic epic, which is usually concerned with somebody extraordinary who defends his territory or who makes great conquests. It's obviously very different from the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Aeneid, which I know some of you have read. The one thing that Beowulf does have in common with these ancient epics, however, is that part of the purpose is to reflect the values of the age. And it seems to me that the first thing we learn about is what is required for good leadership. Shield-Shaving is described as a good king. He has courage, and he is highly aggressive. He is a wrecker of mead benches. That's a nice use of metonymy, the mead bench representing the mead hall or the village. His son, we hear, gives freely, and so he has steadfast companions. His great-grandson, Hrothgar, is also generous and builds a giant mead hall where he can dispense treasure to his warriors. And the purpose for this generosity is that it garners loyalty. The poet says, so that afterwards, when fighting starts, steadfast companions will stand by him. These three attributes represent the code of comitatus, or the companion code. The warriors or thanes promise to be courageous and loyal in return for the Lord's generosity. It's a cultural contract upon which social stability depends, and we will see it fail catastrophically at the end of the poem. One aspect of Beowulf that often puts students off is the boast. Beowulf boasts when he arrives at Hrothgar's hall. He boasts in front of Queen Walktheo and before fighting Grendel. He recalls his boast, for instance. And it's important to remember this is not simply bragging, right? The boast functioned as a resume, right? Presenting your credentials, as a contract, but also as a promise. Another aspect of the poem to pay attention to really from the start are the references to God, and we find these throughout. We also find references to pagan beliefs and practices, like, for instance, Beowulf looking at omens before setting sail, or the Danes turning to pagan rituals to rid themselves of Grendel. Beowulf, in a single sentence, refers to both God, a providential God being in control, but also fate or weird being in control. And so we might say that the poem is transitional in terms of religion. It's certainly monotheistic, but it's not Christian per se, right? As there's not a single reference, for instance, to Christ. Okay, so we come to Grendel. It's interesting that he shows up right after the narrator tells us that Herod the Mead Hall will one day be destroyed. He says, quote, the killer instinct unleashed among in-laws, the bloodlust rampant. There's another reference to kin killing, to families turning on each other later in the poem at line 1016. Grendel is a mysterious character. We know that he, quote, nursed a hard grievance and that it, quote, harrowed him to hear the noise from the hall and the song of the scop or the bard singing Genesis. He dwells in, quote, misery and is associated with Cain's clan, right? He must be large because he grabs 30 men whom he eats, including, the poet tells us in an odd detail, the hands and the feet. And the problem, though, apart from the cannibalism, remember all monsters are cannibalistic, and this is usually a metaphor, right, for behavior that we might say eats away at society, is that the problem with Grendel is he will not parley or make peace, nor will he pay the death price or compensation. This is known as wergild, man price, mangold. And this compensation, along with revenge, is really crucial to ending feuds. Beowulf himself is a mysterious figure. He is clearly ideal. I had a professor when I was an undergraduate, Renoir. He was like the grandson of the famous painter. And he said once that we never hear what's going on inside our hero's head because nothing is going on in his head. But he's nonetheless clearly ideal. All right. He's motivated to help Hrothgar partly for the fame, which provides a form of immortality in the pagan world, and for the treasure, that is, to pay his warriors, but also because of reciprocity. We learn, crucially, that Hrothgar settled his father's feud. Beowulf's father had murdered somebody, and Hrothgar had paid off the family. Finally, notice as you read some of the details, I like the way sometimes the poet goes into a micro focus. For instance, when Beowulf and his men land, the poet says the sand churned in the surf. It's just an odd detail to include. He also is visual, and we also have auditory images. The shields and the armor are often said to shine and glitter. We hear the chainmail clattering or clashing. And there's also, he repeatedly references these boar images or totems throughout. Okay, and finally, the poem is notorious for digressions, right? In the first part that you'll read, there are two. One is a Scot begins to create a song to commemorate Beowulf's victory over Grendel, in which he tells us about Sigmund, an ancestor who had defeated a dragon. This also serves as foreshadowing in the poem. And another digression again is they celebrate in the mead hall. And you might think about as you're reading, and I'll ask you about this, what is the purpose for these? What is their perhaps thematic purpose? Okay? Thanks for listening.